Welcome to the Sectionalism and Compromise Study Guide. Sectionalism is a strong sense of loyalty to a state or a section of a country rather than the whole country itself, and it was becoming a really big problem for the United States. The North viewed the South as immoral because they kept slaves, and the South argued that slavery should be allowed in any territory and that the North had the duty to return those runaway slaves to their owners. In 1818, Missouri asked for statehood. They wanted to join the Union as a slave state. At that time, we had an even number of free and slave states in Congress, 11 free and 11 slave. Missouri would have given the South an advantage, 12 slave states over 11 free, which meant they could have outvoted the North in almost every issue. They argued in Congress for a year or so about whether to admit Missouri, and then Maine decided to ask for statehood. Henry Clay, the great compromiser, came up with the Missouri Compromise. Missouri would be admitted as a slave state. Maine would be admitted as a free state. This would keep the balance in Congress to 12-12, so there wouldn't be anybody outvoted or with an advantage. The Missouri Compromise also drew a line along the southern border of Missouri all the way across Louisiana Territory. That then became the slave line. All new states above that line would be free states, except for Missouri, and all new states below that line would allow slavery. After the Mexican War, the North had decided that they did not want slavery in the new Mexican cession land. So David Wilmot, a congressman from Pennsylvania, called on Congress to outlaw slavery in any land taken from Mexico. He called this the Wilmot Proviso, after him, of course. The Southerners argued that the government didn't have the right to ban slavery in any territory. So despite the fact that it passed in the House, it ended up failing in the Senate. Some Americans thought the Missouri Compromise line should stretch all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The problem with that is that it cut California in half. This would allow slaves only south of the Compromise line, which would mean that California could have slaves in the lower half but not in the upper half. This could be a problem. Other Americans believed in popular sovereignty, the right for the people to choose for themselves through voting whether to be free or slave states. Debate over slavery became even more heated by 1848. Northerners in both the Whig and the Democratic parties were opposed to slavery and trying desperately to get their parties to take a stand on the issue, but they wouldn't because they were afraid they were going to lose Southern votes on important issues if they voted against slavery. In 1848, the anti-slavery members of both the Whig and the Democratic parties had had enough, and they decided to form their own party, the Free Soil Party. Most members were opposed to the expansion of slavery into the West. So in the election of 1848, we had three candidates running for president: Zachary Taylor for the Whig Party, Lewis Cass for the Democratic Party, and Martin Van Buren for the Free Soil Party. That would not be my choice for a Free Soil candidate since he didn't win his second term of office the first time he was president, but I guess he was the best that they had at the time. The results of the election were that Zachary Taylor became the new president, so the Whigs retained control of the presidency. And 13 Free Soil members won congressional seats. That showed that there was a lot of support for stopping the movement of slavery. In 1850, California asked Congress for admission to the Union as a free state. Once again, we're back to that creating an imbalance. Well, there was lots of arguing again, and in their discussions on the Senate floor, Thomas Hart Benton argued in favor of statehood for California. Senator Henry Stewart Foote tried to block their admission. Benton denounced Foote on the floor of Congress, so Foote took a pistol from his pocket, marched across the Senate floor, and aimed it at Benton. Well, Benton pulled a Dirty Harry moment for the young kids. That's an old Clint Eastwood movie, make my day kind of thing. And he said, "Let him fire. Stand out of the way and let the assassin fire." So emotions were running really high over the issue of slavery and over the issue of whether California should come in as a free or a slave state. California's admission would shift the balance in Congress in favor of the free states. So they once again called on Henry Clay, who's now 73, to find a solution to this problem. John C. Calhoun, as expected, led the South's fight against compromise on the slavery issue. He argued that the Western territories must be allowed to have slaves, and that the North had an obligation to return the fugitive slaves. He also, and not unexpectedly again, suggested that the South should peacefully secede if the issue of slavery was not resolved. That seemed to be his solution every time the South wasn't getting their way, to secede and leave the Union. Daniel Webster agreed to support Clay's compromise to save the Union. He considered slavery evil, but saving the Union came first with him. Webster wanted the slave trade in Washington, D.C. stopped, however, so he said that if they would stop the trade in D.C., he would agree to support the fugitive slaves being returned to the South. President Taylor did not support Clay's compromise. However, he unexpectedly died of food poisoning. Because he died, Millard Fillmore became our new president of the United States, and he supported Clay's compromise. About the same time, John C. Calhoun died from natural causes, so a compromise over California's admission now seemed possible. Clay himself was very sick, and he wasn't able to campaign for this compromise, so he asked a senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglas, to take over for him. And he's the person who actually convinced people to support Henry Clay's compromise, or the Compromise of 1850. The compromise they agreed on was: 1. California would enter as a free state. 2. The Mexican Cession was divided into 2 territories, Utah and New Mexico. The territories would use popular sovereignty to decide whether to enter as a free or a slave state. Slave trade in Washington, D.C. would end, and a stricter fugitive slave law would be passed. As with all compromises, nobody was completely happy, but they were able to agree on it and allow California to enter the Union as a new state. The new Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 required citizens in the North to catch runaway slaves, or they could be fined or sent to jail. A new court was created to hear these cases regarding runaway slaves, but it was set up to find runaways, and the judges were paid $10 for every runaway slave returned to the South, and only $5 if they found that the person was a free African American and not a slave. Thousands of free African Americans fled to Canada because they knew they were going to be captured and sent to court, and the judges, some of them corrupt, would send them back to the South even though they were free. Northerners hated the law because it forced them in the position of returning slaves that they didn't believe should be returned, and so it spurred many people to join the abolitionist movements. In 1852, a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe, who had never been a slave, she was a white woman, published a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin. The book detailed the fictional life of a kind, deeply religious slave who was sold to a cruel owner who treats him brutally. It also discusses some of the other slaves and their escape attempts and what happened to them when they were caught. Ultimately, in the book, Uncle Tom is actually beaten to death. The book stirred lots of emotions and debate in both the North and the South over slavery, and it actually turned it from a political issue into a moral issue of whether it was right, morally right, to treat people, human beings, like this. In its first year, it sold over 300,000 copies. It was like the big first blockbuster. When Stowe met President Lincoln during the Civil War, he is said to have commented, "So this is the little woman who made this big war." Of course, we don't know if he really said that, but it's come through history that he did. In 1854, Stephen Douglas proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It proposed splitting the Nebraska Territory into 2 parts, Kansas and Nebraska. Douglas hoped to build a railroad from Illinois to California, and he thought that this railroad would help him win votes in the next presidential election. To keep from upsetting the South, he proposed that each territory use popular sovereignty to choose whether to be free or slave states. Most of those who settled in Kansas were farmers. Some were abolitionists and others were pro-slavery. But there were some border ruffians or some pro-slavery gangs from Missouri that would ride across the border to Kansas to harass the abolitionist settlers, trying to convince them to leave because they wanted to make sure that Kansas became a slave state. In 1855, Kansas elected its first legislature, and every legislator that was elected was pro-slavery. And this was due to corruption and some illegal voting. The Missouri border ruffians came over and voted in the Kansas election. Well, needless to say, the abolitionist settlers refused to accept the results because they weren't accurate and they were not legal. So they held their own election. They elected, of course, all abolitionist governor and legislators. Now you have two governments in the same territory trying to run things. One pro-slavery, one abolitionist. This was not going to work. In 1856, some men decided to raid the town of Lawrence. They destroyed the homes and property of the abolitionists. Well, John Brown was a staunch abolitionist, and he decided to retaliate with violence. Brown attacked settlers in Pottawatomie Creek. He dragged 5 pro-slavery men from their beds in the middle of the night and murdered them. This sparked more violence because each one wanted to retaliate and get back at the other. And by the end of 1856, more than 200 people had been killed in Kansas. And that led the newspapers to call the violence Bleeding Kansas because it looked like the ground was bleeding blood. There were so many people being killed. Even in Congress, they were not beyond the violence over slavery. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts often spoke against slavery in Congress, and one day, in his comments, he insulted Senator Andrew Butler from South Carolina. Well, Butler's nephew, Preston Brooks, was also a senator from South Carolina, and he was so upset that he marched across the Senate floor and beat Senator Sumner over the head with a heavy cane until he was unconscious. That shows you just how heated their feelings were over the issue of slavery. All the Southerners in the Senate thought Sumner had gotten what he deserved for making the comment that he did. The Northerners thought that this beating showed the brutality of slavery. If a Southern senator would beat another senator unconscious on the Senate floor, what must they be doing to those poor slaves that have no choice but to do what they're told or to put up with the beatings? It just showed that the slavery issue was coming to a head, and we were no longer going to be able to put it off and keep postponing what to do about slavery in the United States. And now you know a little bit about sectionalism, compromise, and the steps that started us on the road to the Civil War.